Hello, my apologies for not getting part 3 of this study of the Great Commandment out sooner. This is, as I say, the third part of an examination of Matthew 22. The 36th verse has been the general starting point. I'm going to go a little bit back from that to the 33rd verse today, and I'm looking at several translations that are not within the lineage of the Authorized version of 1611 on through the New Revised Standard version of Bruce Metzger. So this is an exploration of other ways that Matthew 22:33 and following is rendered. I'm going to start with one that probably is familiar to people in the 21st century more than some of the others. It's the most recent of the translations I'm going to look at tonight. My page is conveniently torn out. The Living Bible, it is a paraphrased version that was first printed in 1971, which is getting to be a bit old, but I'm a bit old too. So this is how the Living Bible renders Matthew 22:33 through we'll go to the 40th verse. The crowds were profoundly impressed by his answers, by Jesus' answers. The crowds were profoundly impressed by his answers, but not the Pharisees. When they heard that he had routed the Sadducees with his reply, they thought up a fresh question of their own to ask him. One of them, a lawyer, spoke up, "Sir, which is the most important command in the law of Moses?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second most important is similar. Love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. All the other commandments and all the demands of the prophets stem from these two laws and are fulfilled if you obey them. Keep only these, and you will find that you are obeying all the others." So that's the Living Bible of 1971. Now let's go and explore some earlier translations. This is one that says, "A new translation by James Moffett." Well, it was new once upon a time. I believe the first copyright date for this is 1922. So it was good and fresh 100 years ago. Let's hear how James Moffett renders Matthew 30. Actually, let's go from Matthew 22:34 through Matthew 22:40. Okay. I'll back up to the 33rd verse so that I'm reading the same material. Okay. "And when the crowds heard it, they were astounded at his teaching. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they mustered their forces, and one of them, a jurist, put a question in order to tempt him. 'Teacher,' he said, 'what is the greatest commandment in the law?" He replied, "You must love the Lord your God with your whole heart, with your whole soul, and with your whole mind. This is the greatest and chief command. There is a second like it. You must love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets hang upon these two commands." Are you getting the gist? Okay, so here's one. This is the New Testament in basic English. And this dates to 1941, so it's more contemporary, I suppose, than James Moffat. Let's see whether the language is more contemporary. "And the people, hearing it, were surprised at his teaching. But the Pharisees, seeing how the mouths of the Sadducees had been stopped, came together, and one of them, a teacher of the law, put a question to him, testing him, and saying, 'Master, which is the chief rule in the law?' And he said to him, 'Have love for the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest rule. And a second like it is this: have love for your neighbor as for yourself. On these two rules all the law and the prophets are based.'" So I want to comment quickly on that, which is the first one that I can remember where the word command or commandment is shifted to the word rule. Otherwise, the translation of the Greek words is really pretty consistent, even though there's a little bit of kind of rendering these things into what seems like an easier framework, given whatever time the thing was done. So here's another one. This is called, well, you can't see, the New Testament in Modern Speech by Richard Francis Weymouth. And this one's a little bit more recent than the New Testament in Basic English, which was 1941. This one dates to 1943. So we're, really getting ahead here. Okay, so this one says, "All the crowd heard this and were filled with amazement at his teaching. Now the Pharisees came up when they heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, and one of them, an expounder of the law, asked him as a test question, 'Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment in the law?' He answered, 'Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy whole soul, and thy whole mind.'" I'm sorry, I misread it. "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, thy whole soul, and thy whole mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. And the second is similar to it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as much as thyself. The whole of the law and the prophets is summed up in these two commandments." Now, this Weymouth's rendering I find interesting because, and I don't know that you'll be able to see this, but the biblical references that Jesus is making are incorporated right into the text. So I don't, there's no indication in any manuscript that I've ever read about where Jesus says, "Oh, well, that's, Deuteronomy 6:5. But Weymouth wants to help you out, so he puts it right there so you know that Jesus is quoting Scripture. And this one's interesting too. All of these have different ways of talking about who it is who's addressing Jesus. So in this one, it is an expounder of the law, in Weymouth's translation. The basic English renders it a teacher of the law. The Moffat has it as a jurist, which is kind of interesting. I'm not quite sure what a jurist is, but that's who it was, and according to Moffat. And this one has a lawyer. So it's intriguing to have 4 different translations, and while they're, well, on most of the points, you know, the soul and the mind and the heart, you know, those, they're not using those, but you know, they're getting that part the same. But this business of who it is who's addressing Jesus is distinguished in the different renderings. So this is not really, there's not a tremendous amount of diversity between these, so it's maybe not the greatest example that could be thought of the diversity that sometimes there can be between the translations. But if you listen to these renderings, you can see that some of them, the paraphrastic Living Bible, for example, gives a little bit more sense, a little bit more color to the scene. And I incorporated verse 33, which is usually left part of the passage or the section before the question about the great law. But the Living Bible draws it down because it wants to make a link, or whoever the translator, the person who wrote the paraphrase, wanted to make a link between the story where the Sadducees come and ask a question and the story where the Pharisees ask a question of Jesus. And the way that they linked it was saying the crowds were excited, but not the Pharisees. Whereas the other translations keep these two passages separate. The passage that ends at Matthew 22:33, they keep as a separate paragraph, and then they start a new paragraph and a new section with the Pharisees were unimpressed when they saw that the Sadducees had been put down. Then they, you know, they gathered their forces together and did such and such. So in part 4, which I'm hoping to complete tonight, I'll look at the broader context of this passage of the Great Commandment, and say a little bit about the preceding pericope or passage and the one that follows it, just so that you can see how different ways of expanding an understanding of, in this case, a very small portion of Scripture, and the way that Bible study can really expand on even this very small 4 verses, 4 or 5 verses, but you can really spend a lot of time on it anyway. I don't know how much richness we're getting out of this particular one, but anyway, so This concludes part 3, and I'll see you in part 4.